All right, let's now bring in our diplomatic editor, James Space, who is live with us from London. James, we heard a short while ago from Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel after, I believe, what was a meeting, a four-way meeting with Turkey, the UK, France and Germany on Syria. Do we know what came out of those discussions?
We don't, but we do know the backdrop, which is real disagreement, and that came out very publicly from President Macron earlier on when he was with President Trump, making it clear that he disagrees very much with Turkey's position on Syria, saying that Turkey regards people as terrorists, who he says are the people that we've been fighting alongside. So clearly there is a problem here, and I think many of the NATO allies are concerned. We have an odd situation now, if you look at the history of the war, the 8-year war in Syria, that right now Turkey is pretty well aligned and has a pretty cordial relationship with Russia now on Syria. And of course, Russia is on the side of the Assad regime and on the side of Iran. Now, those are not normal bedfellows for NATO. So there are problems, real problems in the relationship between Turkey and the rest of NATO, because add on the Turkish purchase of Russian missile systems, and you have real tensions in this alliance. But of course, that is just one of multiple tensions happening at the same time at this summit, supposed to be NATO's 70th birthday party, and some seeing it almost as a wake.
Indeed, and we did see those divisions come across during the press conference, the news conference between the American and French leaders. And in fact, they're not even calling this a summit, James. I believe it's now a meeting, a NATO meeting. What are we expecting to come out of it then?
Well, I think they're not. They're saying it's not a summit. That's the diplomats of the Foreign Office trying to get out of the fact that nothing is going to be agreed here. I think when you have all the leaders of all the NATO countries, that is the top of the mountain. That is the summit. So I'm not quite so sure about that definition. It's going to be a very difficult meeting because the divisions are so obvious and so exposed. That's one of the things you get with President Trump. He wants the reporters in there, and he says exactly what he thinks. So you've got President Trump against the rest when it comes to NATO's budget, bringing in the normally unconnected issues of international trade. You've got the tension between President Trump and President Macron that you've seen openly on display on a number of issues. You have President Erdogan against everyone else when it comes to Syria. The one that we haven't remarked on yet, which I'm told by very senior figures is actually very serious, is a growing rift between the Germans and the French, between Macron and Merkel over leadership of Europe and Europe's role in NATO. There's a personal element to this. You have a young, vibrant French leader who can't do much on the domestic stage, so is doing everything on the international stage, and a German leader who is in the end period of her time. Add on to that the fact we're here in the UK, there's a general election taking place. We have the toxic atmosphere of Brexit, which of course affects relations with European allies. It's a multi-dimensional mess.
Indeed, and I imagine the Russians watching all this very closely. Russian President Vladimir Putin has, in fact, criticized NATO's continued expansion. Do we get a sense of, whether they'll be able to bridge these differences on an issue like Turkey, for instance? We had the threat from Turkey's President Erdogan. Will they be able to find common ground on the Turkey issue?
Well, I think that issue, which is Turkey linking what's going on in Syria to other issues and their agreement on other issues, is serious and is related, of course, to Russia, because what Turkey is talking about not agreeing to is extra protection for the Baltic states and for Poland, who fear Russia potentially. Already you have NATO countries with forces in those countries, but keeping those arrangements going will need the agreement of all the allies, and Turkey is threatening to block that. Of course, the other thing you still have going is the problems in Ukraine, probably something because of the domestic implications of that for President Trump he's not going to talk about very much. The diplomacy on that will come in the next few days, and although there's disagreements between the French and the Germans, they are the ones in the so-called Normandy format that will be trying to make some progress on Ukraine.
Just coming back to that meeting on Syria, that four-way meeting on Syria, I understand it was supposed to focus on raising funds for housing Syrian refugees, James. Do we know what they came up with? I know it just happened very shortly, a short while ago. But,
I haven't got details of what actually happened there, but clearly the key areas as we come, I think, towards the end game in the war in Syria, that you look at what happens next in Syria is going to be the reconstruction of Syria, the potential return of the refugees, and whether you can have a new constitution and then a new elections in Syria. That's what the UN is working on in those talks that have been going on rather quietly in Geneva. And clearly, certainly many of the NATO nations believe that their point of leverage on the Assad regime is the fact that if anyone's going to rebuild Syria, then they can force the Russians and Assad perhaps to change their ways. And certainly they would like the Russians to force the Assad regime to allow free and fair elections. But of course, that's something that hasn't happened in Syria since the Assad family took over nearly 50 years ago.
All right, James, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much for speaking to us about all this, and we'll come back to you in a few minutes after the top of the hour here on Al Jazeera.